All right. Do you guys mind if I get started? Okay. All right. Well, I'll get started. And then if there's any other questions or issues or anything like that, please just feel free to put it in the chat. We've got some wonderful students helping out with this event, and I'm sure they'll be able to help you if you have any questions. So welcome everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. My name is Alizé Carrère. I am a PhD student at the University of Miami right now. I'm in my third year, and I research climate change adaptation and how different what are different design responses for how we are going to live with climate change. But that is not the topic I'm going to talk to you guys about today precisely. I'm actually going to talk to you a little bit about something a little bit more broad, which was about adaptation in general and how my trajectory as a National Geographic explorer and as somebody who looks at issues of climate change and very much the human dimensions of climate change, how I came about that research and my particular path. And I hope that some of this will be inspirational to those of you who are looking to head on to college or go out into the world and be activists and engaged in the climate crisis, the solutions and topics of engagement that we really need all hands on deck for right now. So please, I look forward to answering any questions you have about my journey as I go through it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint to go over with you all, and I just want to, before I begin, say thank you so much to the Miami Youth Climate Summit for reaching out to me and asking me to participate. Leanne was one of the original people who sent me a message and asked if I would partake, and I was so honored. And I'm really, all of the work that I do is meant to inspire the next generation, and I hope that all of this, the topic of climate change adaptation will make you feel like you have a role to play in finding solutions and being a part of mitigation and adaptation efforts as we face this really incredible and daunting reality. So a bit about myself. I'm a National Geographic explorer, which I'll explain what that title actually means in a minute. I'm also a filmmaker. I do a lot of short films on different science and environmental and climate change related issues, which I've found to be a really wonderful medium. You know, we all love film and media, and we're on our phones a lot these days, and that's how we take in a lot of information. And so I really wanted to blend my research with filmmaking to make that more impactful for the younger generation. And then last but not least, I'm doing my PhD, as I mentioned, at the University of Miami on climate change adaptation. But let me just back up a little bit and tell you guys where I'm from and my journey to to how I became a National Geographic explorer and where I came from. I'm originally from New York, but not New York City, which I know a lot of us tend to think of when we hear New York. I'm from a place called Ithaca, New York, which is on the edge of Cayuga Lake, one of the Finger Lakes. In this portion here, you can see that they're called the Finger Lakes because they look like sort of like a hand of sorts or a print. And Ithaca is quite well known for a number of different reasons. Some of you might know of it because of Cornell University. There's also Ithaca College. It's a really wonderful place to grow up as a kid. It's very green and verdant. We get a lot of snow. It's very cold in the winter. But this is the house that I grew up in. And if you guys look carefully, you'll see that there's a giant 300-year-old oak tree growing through the front of our porch. And the reason I show this image is that this home for me was really the origin almost of my passion for the natural world, my passion and interest in understanding how humans live with nature, because this tree was very much a part of our life and our home. Our house was very dynamic as a result of this tree. We had to rake every season. Every time the leaves would fall in the fall, it would just bury our house under a cloud of foliage, or kind of a pillow of foliage is maybe a better metaphor. And we had carpenter ants and squirrels' nests and just every imaginable thing that a tree going through your kind of front portion of your house would bring in terms of kind of troubles or concerns. We faced it. And in a way, the work that I do today is looking at how people respond to climate change, how people adapt to climate change. And on a much smaller scale, and obviously with much lower stakes, my house was sort of an example of that growing up. We were constantly learning to live in balance with this tree and all of the living components of it that were in many ways a part of our home. When I was a kid, I used to draw tree houses all the time because I thought that a lot of people lived in tree houses. My understanding of the boundaries between the human life and nature were very blurry. And I think that, as I said, in many ways that sort of inspired what I ended up going off to do in my career as I look at how people respond to the natural world around them, and increasingly today, specifically looking at how people respond to climate change. So I went to Ithaca High School, which is a public high school that was in my hometown. And it wasn't until I took AP Environmental Science that I learned my passion and love for the natural world and for science and how that connected to people. And I heard in Delaney's incredible keynote that there were a lot of APES teachers and environmental science teachers tuning in. And this is my sort of love note to my environmental educators who helped support my path as I started to get really interested in environmental science, because it really wasn't until my junior year in high school when I took APES that I really understood the value of science and how it was connected to my life on a day-to-day basis. Taking biology and chemistry and plenty of these other natural science courses are so important, and they really give you the foundation of the scientific or the natural world. But I think for me personally, what was so illuminating about environmental science was that it connected all of that to my existence, where I could see it, I could feel it. It was what we ate, it was what we breathed, it was what we wore. It was part of how science became a part of this sort of bigger conversation about the interactions humans have with their natural environment. And it was because of that AP Environmental Science class, which, by the way, behind our high school, we had this beautiful waterfall. And our AP Environmental Science teacher used to take us out there to do labs. We would collect crayfish and learn about how different pollutants were affecting organisms, and really, again, bringing us into nature and understanding how critical these issues were to our life every day, and why, and making us really feel that, and quite literally. So it was because of that class that I decided when I went to college that I wanted to go into environmental studies. And I know there's a lot of you on here who are in high school. Some of you might not be entirely certain yet what path you want to take when you go to college and what degrees you want to major in. But one of the things I can say is that, having done an environmental studies major for my undergraduate degree, I went to McGill University in Montreal, Canada, which was just about 5 hours north of where I lived in upstate New York. This was an incredible place and an incredible major to learn a really wide variety of issues, both sort of the social sciences and the natural sciences, and it really gave me a baseline understanding of how, specifically climate change, because again, climate change obviously is a large portion of big part of the a focal point of the studies in environmental science degrees. But this was a really powerful way for me to understand the interdisciplinary nature of climate change and how it impacts lots of different sectors of society. And so if some of you guys are not yet sure what you want to do, but you're interested in issues of climate change, you're interested in environmental issues and the human components of that, I would say definitely look into an environmental studies major or an environmental sciences major. They are getting much more popular these days, and they really afford you an incredibly diverse and strong foundation for any type of, if you wanted to go on into different professions that, a lot of employers are looking for students who have an interdisciplinary training. So this is a really great option if you are interested in these issues, and specifically, as I mentioned, the social science aspect, which is really where I found my passion in the sciences. I stayed at McGill and also did a master's in water resources management. I really loved McGill University. They're a great research institution, and had wonderful professors who really cultivated my passion for the natural world and bringing in different human aspects of that. I took a lot of anthropology courses, sociology, courses that allowed me to integrate the natural world with the human one. And as I mentioned, now I'm at the University of Miami studying ecosystem science and policy at the Abess Center, which is, again, a very wonderfully interdisciplinary center on campus that continues to nurture my passion for bridging the social sciences and the natural sciences. All right, but now let's get to the fun stuff. So a lot of people ask, well, how do you become a National Geographic Explorer? What does that even mean? So I got a grant from National Geographic, from the National Geographic Society, which is the nonprofit division of National Geographic, in 2013. And at the time, it was a program called the National Geographic Young Explorer Program, but it's now called the National Geographic Early Career Grant Program. And I would encourage all of you, if you're interested, once you reach the age of 18, you should check out National Geographic grants, and you can put that into Google and learn about the Early Career Grant Program, because they're meant for people who don't yet have a lot of research experience in the field, but who nonetheless have an idea or a research question. It could be something related to, mine happened to be in Madagascar, which I'm going to tell you about in a second, but you could be photography related, it could be film related, conservation. It could be specific in they support lots and lots and lots of different questions that young people have who then want to go out into the field and do that. Now, I will, just as a side note, say that right now, because of COVID, they've actually suspended some of their grant programs for the time being, just because of the travel restrictions. But nonetheless, I would say when you are of age, I think it's 18 is the earliest you can start looking at this program, but take a look at it. There are some really wonderful opportunities for you to pitch an idea that you would then get to be able to go out and do in the field. So my pitch to them was to go to Madagascar. And I had heard from a geography professor of mine during my undergraduate degree at McGill that farmers were adapting in this really innovative way to deforestation. Now, obviously in this image, you're seeing lemurs on my shoulders, which are the very gregarious and kind of mascot creature of Madagascar. And that's why a lot of people do go to Madagascar, to see lemurs in the wild. That is actually not why I was there, but in this image, I was at a lemur sanctuary where lemurs had been, they're being rehabilitated back into the natural environment after having been in the exotic animal trade for some time. So normally wild lemurs would certainly not be hopping on your shoulders like this, but in this sanctuary, they are very accustomed to humans, and they're trying to reintegrate them back into the wild so that they can live a normal life as a wild lemur. Now, obviously, that probably won't ever be the case fully, because they've been too accustomed to humans. But this sanctuary provides a space for captivated or captured lemurs to be out in the wild and at least have more of a natural environment to roam around in. But as I mentioned, that's not why I went to Madagascar. I actually went and this was the proposal I put in for my National Geographic grant, was to study deforestation and how farmers were adapting. So there's the island of Madagascar hanging off the southeastern coasts of continental Africa. And it's the 4th largest island in the world, so quite large. And as a result of that, there's also a lot of species that you find in Madagascar that are found nowhere else on Earth. And that's because of having evolved for so many millions of years in isolation. You find very incredible endemic species that are, there are several species of lemur, fusas, different insects that are really just incredibly particular to Madagascar. And like I said, that's why a lot of people go there. But that was not why I went there. I went there to study trees, or the lack thereof. So in this image, you're seeing a lot of burning and deforestation taking place across the highland area. This is in the central highlands of the island in Madagascar. And the reasons a lot of this burning is taking place is because of charcoal production, which is how a lot of the energy source on the island goes. People will cut down trees, they burn them in an anaerobic environment, and then they make charcoal. And then they use that to cook, to heat their homes. And that, of course, is driving a lot of the deforestation across the island because of the need for the tree matter. Tavi, which is a slash and burn agriculture. It's the local word for slash and burn agriculture. This is when you cut down organic matter, trees, bushes, and then you burn it so that the nutrient, the ash from that burned material, reintegrates into the soil. And that can, over time, if it's done at proper intervals, that can add nutrients to the soil and make it more fertile to grow crops. But this is happening at a rate that is far greater than soil regeneration processes. So it turns the soil very brittle and depletes it of its nutrients over time, as you can imagine. There's also a lot of deforestation happening because of rice production. So down here, you can see all this water. This flat, wet area is a prime place for growing rice. So some forested areas are cleared to be able to grow rice. Rice is a very, very large part of the Malagasy diet. And then zebu grazing. Zebu is the local form of cattle. So if you see in this image here, these the cows that are roaming there, they love to eat bushy grasses. They don't like dense wooded areas. And so a lot of the uh, farmers and pastoralists will clear forested areas to let their cattle roam, and then they eat the very sweet greens, the fresh greens that come up from the soil when it rains. And then last but not least, there's a very large market driven by the exotic wood trade. So people cutting down beautiful hardwoods across the island, which then get shipped to other parts of the world to be used in kitchens or floors or what have you, as a, you know, as a material for building and for accents. Now, what happens when you remove all of this tree matter above ground is that you also are removing the root infrastructure below ground. And this is what, when you don't have all the roots to hold the soil together, it makes the soil very susceptible to erosion. And this is what was starting to occur across the highlands of Madagascar, was something called a lavaca, which in the Malagasy language literally translates to the word hole, which basically, I mean, you can see it kind of like farmers were seeing these large holes forming on the landscape, which are essentially giant landslides in a way, but they happen over a little bit, they can happen, they can be acute, they can take place overnight, but really they start as a small fissure or crack, and then they start to widen and broaden over time into these very significant landscape features. And what you're seeing here are two lavaca that are starting, they're still growing, but all of the soil that was once inside the lavaca here erodes down and dumps down on the fields that are below. So any farmer who has a field at the base of one of these lavaca will obviously, this is a really dangerous and destructive occurrence phenomenon, because it ends up destroying generations of labor in a matter of days. So lavaca, as they've been around on the island of Madagascar for many years. In fact, there's some debate in the academic literature about how long they've actually been around, even prior to some of the very severe deforestation taking place. But what we do know for sure is that the increased deforestation makes the manifestation of lavaca much, much more likely, because of the fact that the soil is so loose and susceptible to erosion. So my grant was to go to Madagascar and really understand how farmers were adapting to the consequences of lavaca, and how were they adapting to having lavaca on their landscape. I worked with a local Malagasy field assistant. This is, she's an agricultural journalist, Andu, and together we rode dirt bikes throughout the highlands of Madagascar and stopped and asked farmers who had lavaca on their land what they were doing to live with them. And what we learned in the process of this ethnographic study, when we interviewed hundreds of different farmers and talked to them about how their practices were changing, was what we learned was incredibly fascinating and frankly quite unexpected. If you guys look carefully at this image, you'll see that there are trees on this landscape, but they're inside the lavaca. So what we learned from the farmers is that over time, trees, basically the lavaca, once it's stabilized a little bit, so not immediately after they form, but maybe a couple years later, a lavaca is almost like a pocket, like a depression on the landscape that serves as a place that collects nutrient-rich topsoil and water that tumbles down from higher elevations. So if you have a rain event and it brings a lot of water and, like I said, sort of the richer topsoils, which unfortunately are being lost at higher elevations, but being trapped inside these lavaca, suddenly the lavaca becomes like a very fertile micro pocket on the landscape where trees and seeds and things like that get caught and start to take root. And in comparison to other parts of the landscape, you can see that it would be much more fertile. And so the trees start to grow inside the lavaca. And the farmers saw this and they said, well, wait a minute, why are we going to farm on the landscapes out here and do all this very labor intensive practice when we can just practice basically a form of agroforestry, which is the idea that you practice you do crop planting alongside trees. They said, why don't we do a form of agroforestry inside the lavaca? So the lavaca almost becomes like a little mini farm. And so the farmers, we started to, through our conversations with them, we realized that they were starting to change their practices to take advantage of these erosional gullies, which was completely counterintuitive and unexpected for most people, and certainly the Ministry of Environment and some of the government officials in the capital city. This was a totally new idea for them, that farmers were really using the erosional formations to their benefit, because that just, up until now, Lavaca had only ever been considered a negative socio-ecological consequence of deforestation. So in my research, I spent days, weeks traveling around talking to farmers about Lavaca. So here's a big one. You can see this one's right above the hillsides where the houses are. The farmer here, he said, this Lavaca is like my tree bank. He said he called it his savings account. And I asked him what he meant by that. And he said, well, I go once a week, I retrieve my timber or nut or forest products that I need. And this Lavaca turns into, it's a place where I don't have to practice really labor intensive agriculture. He actually even called it the lazy man's agriculture, because he was able to take what he needed. And because the vegetation was inside the Lavaca, it stabilized it from further eroding. And this is another extraordinary Lavaca. If you look carefully at this one, the farmer has done terrace agriculture all the way up the inner facade. And you can see he's growing, 15 or 16 different varieties of crops. He's using every teeny square inch of the Lavaca that he could possibly find here. And just for scale, this is a person. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but this little black dot here is a person standing. So you can see how massive this one is. And by the way, this is a much older Lavaca. You can tell this had been farmed for 2 generations. And to be clear, Lavaca are not beneficial immediately when they form. They can be, in fact, extremely dangerous. But over time, farmers were adapting to their presence on the landscape by using a form of novel agroforestry and terrace agriculture and other different techniques that they were coming up with to take advantage of the formation. So as you can see, this is an image I took from a helicopter when I was doing my fieldwork, which was really a powerful moment, because this allowed me to see how pervasive the problem was. And it was almost quite jarring, actually, to see this initially. Now this it almost kind of looks like a cat like took its claw and ripped it across the terrain. And I remember in the helicopter thinking, wow, this is so detrimental. Like, how do we ever repair? Like, how do we ever adapt to this? Even though I had just seen farmers practicing these different new forms of agriculture, how do we actually overcome, a reality this big? And what I realized in that moment was that I zoomed my camera in and I started to see this bushy, kind of leafy green vegetation slowly creeping up the interior facades of the Lavaca. And it became clear to me at that moment that these are not happening on timescales that might be relevant necessarily to my life or your life or even my, our grandchildren's lives. This is a 300 or 400 or 500 year process over a time over which these trees will continue to take root in these areas and spill over and then continue to populate sort of the rest of the terrain. So, but this still got me asking this question about, like, well, where else in the world are we seeing people adapting to severe and very acute landscape changes and no more pressing an issue than climate change? And so I went back to National Geographic after I finished my research grant. And I said, well, what if we did a series on this idea, or I want to do a series on this topic of adaptation and what it looks like on the ground. Like, I had just seen these farmers adapting in real time to changes in a very unexpected way. And frankly, a very kind of inspiring way, a very innovative way. And I was curious to know, where else in the world are we seeing that? And could we tell those people's stories who don't typically have a platform or a megaphone to share their experiences living with the realities of changing landscapes? So I went back to the basic definition of adaptation. And it is a change or the process of change by which an organism or species becomes better suited to its environment. Now, that can be a physical change if we're talking about evolution, or that like a structural change, or in my case, I'm talking about a behavioral change. Like, how are we changing our practices and our behaviors, our traditions to live with different changing climates? And so this idea of adaptation, which, as you all know, is being talked about more and more frequently. Now, this was when I first pitched this idea, this was about 7 years ago. So the landscape in terms of just the topic of climate change has changed a lot since then. But at the time, I felt like adaptation was still a novel concept for some people, this idea of how do we adapt to climate change? So this became, actually, I'm just going to share this quote here because this will help you guys understand the context of adaptation. I heard Dr. John Holdren speak. He was one of the former chief technology and science advisors to the Obama administration. And he said, we basically have 3 choices. Now, by the way, he's talking about climate change here: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be required and the less suffering there will be. So when I first heard this, let's just break this apart for a second. So he's saying we've got mitigation, adaptation, and then a certain inevitable degree of suffering. And I think we're seeing this right now across we're seeing all three of these across the world as it relates to climate change in this very moment. As he says, the more mitigation we do, which is getting at the source of the problem, i.e. the combustion of fossil fuels and our greenhouse gas emissions. So the more we focus on mitigation, which many scholars are, many of my colleagues are, that can and should be the focal point of our what we're doing to deal with climate change, because that is truly, we still know we have a window of time to really make changes around how much warming our planet will experience. But the more mitigation we do, the less adaptation that will be required. But of course, there are certain changes that are already in the system that we have to adapt to no matter what, even if we were to shut off all the machines tomorrow. And then of course, the less suffering there will be. My work is very much focused on adaptation. And specifically, as I said, there's lots of people focusing on mitigation right now, which is really where we should absolutely not let off the gas on that. That is incredibly important. But there is a very real prospect of adaptation for so many communities around the world that are either already experiencing the effects of climate change or will in the future. And we here in Miami know exactly what that means. And so my research over the last several years has been looking at adaptation strategies that are coming from communities around the world and telling their stories of how they're living with change in ways that, like I said, they don't necessarily always have a platform or a megaphone to share their experiences. And so this is where my filmmaking comes in, because I got to travel to different parts of the world to make a series called, of course, Adaptation, which looks at how people and communities are adapting very much like we saw, like I just showed you in Madagascar. Farmers and fishermen and communities that might not have high-tech solutions, they might not have a lot of money, but they are nonetheless getting incredibly creative and resilient and coming up with solutions that make sense for them and for their community and for their needs. And that is such a critical part of adaptation. So I've traveled to Bangladesh to look at sea level rise and how communities are adapting there. I've traveled to Vanuatu in the South Pacific, which I'm going to talk to you guys briefly about, to look at coral reef degradation and how communities there are adapting to some of the effects of coral reef degradation. I've traveled to Ladakh, which is in northern India in the Himalayan mountain range. And I went there to learn about glacial melt and how communities are coming up with unique ways of capturing glacial runoff and storing it and using it for later use or later times in the year. And last but not least, I went to Kentucky here in the US and looked at how fishermen and people, different communities along the Mississippi River are adapting to the arrival of an invasive species that is altering the landscape. That specifically is Asian carp, which some of you might have heard of the Asian carp crisis. All of these issues, they're not exclusively about climate change. Many of them are, and many of them are made worse by the effects of climate change, but they are all examples of how people have connected to who are very connected to their natural environment, are coming up with adaptive solutions to live with profound environmental and landscape change. So I'll just give you a quick teaser, because I will say this series is going to be coming out later this year. Unfortunately, I cannot give you more information at this time because it's not public yet, but I will be posting about this on my social media. I'll put all that information in there later at the end of my talk so that you guys can actually watch all of these videos. It's a series of short 15-minute episodes that in each of these places that I'm going to talk to you about, and you guys will get to watch them. There will be curriculum accompanying each of the episodes so that you can use these in your classrooms and talk about them with your teachers. My goal with all of my work is to really make sure that this is usable for all of you in the next generation, specifically educators and students who are engaging with this material every day in the classroom. So just as a quick, I'll just give you a quick overview of what some of these episodes are about. Adaptation Bangladesh is, as I mentioned, about sea level rise and how farmers there are adapting to sea level rise by building floating gardens. This was an amazing experience and trip to go do and see. we visited communities that for many months of the year, because of sea level rise and severe flooding because of the monsoon seasons worsening again as a result of global warming, the fields are submerged underwater sometimes for up to 6 or 7 months of the year. And so you can't, of course, farm when your fields are flooded. So what they've done is created a natural, very low technology version of a floating garden so that no matter what the water levels are, that they can farm on top of the water. And so what you're seeing in this image right here are rows of floating gardens. Now, let me show you how these are made. It's actually quite simple. And this is why I love this story so much, because the farmers that we talked to here explained that this is actually a technique that their ancestors used to use in some of the flooded parts of because Bangladesh is an extremely low-lying country. It's essentially, it sits in a giant river delta at the mouth of the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna rivers. So it's one of the lowest lying countries in the world, and of course with rising sea levels from the south and then severe flooding coming from the north from the Himalayas and glacial melt, they get kind of like a double whammy from both sides, and all of this is influencing how they can grow food on their diminishing volumes of land. So here you can see how this is done. I'm just going to explain quickly. This is a water weed called water hyacinth that is very abundant. In fact, throughout many parts of of Asia, there's lots and lots of water hyacinth that floats on the water. It's kind of like a water lily that floats on the top and has a very dense root system that floats, but that is, you can kind of push them together and make like a mat, like a bed. And then they'll push bunches of it together, and then they put down long bamboo rods. Then they put another layer of the water hyacinth, and then they put fertilizer, and they let that sit for about 15 days, and it turns into a buoyant raft, like a pad, like an organic pad that they then plant crops on top of. And this is how the floating garden technology works. And it's like I said, it's quite simple and uses local materials, but this really helps communities in times when the floods are so severe that they can't actually farm otherwise. And you can imagine how important this is specifically for farmers who are just growing the food that they eat. They're quite sturdy. This was my co-host and I for the series. I'm the host of the series, so you guys will, when it comes out, I kind of guide the viewer through it. But we always talk with local people so that they can share their stories and tell us what it is that they're doing to adapt. And this underneath us, there's about 6 feet of water. So they're really quite sturdy. We were standing on them. Tanya, my co-host, was jumping on them almost like a trampoline. They're really quite an impressive solution, for temporary solution anyway, for some of the consequences of sea level rise that they're facing. I'm running low on time, so I'm just going to quickly breeze through one of the other episodes. This is our 3rd episode in the series. We go to Vanuatu, which is an island nation in the South Pacific, quite near Fiji. Just to orient you, here's a map of the world, and Vanuatu is way over here in the South Pacific. It's a collection of 83 islands, and we went there to film stories of how fishermen and farmers are adapting to coral reef degradation. Now, as we know, climate change is doing severe damage due to ocean acidification, warming, bleach. There's so much happening as a result of climate change. But there is another thing happening to the reefs in Vanuatu that is quite unexpected. It is exacerbated by climate change, but this is also a native predator to the region. This is a picture of some beautiful corals that I had the chance to see on a dive in Vanuatu. But this guy, some of you might have heard of the crown of thorns sea star, is a predatory starfish that is native to the Indo-Pacific region, but they're proliferating. There are outbreaks of crown of thorns, and they've done a lot of damage to the Great Barrier Reef and many other coral reefs around the world. And in Vanuatu, they've been suffering from very severe outbreaks of this starfish. Now, the reason this is a problem is because this starfish eats coral. They'll go across, like they kind of move across coral like a lawnmower, and they just suck out the coral polyps, which is the living part of the coral, and then they leave behind a dead white, the limestone skeleton of the coral in their wake. And when you have an outbreak of hundreds of thousands of these at once, they can kill off a reef in a matter of like 3 to 4 days. It's astonishing the amount of damage they can do. And they have a toxin in them, so they have very few predators. So if you get stung by one of these, it's not only extremely painful, but if you get stung in too many places all at once, it can really shock your system. So they don't have very many natural predators. Really, humans are their only control if they get out of balance once they reach maturity at this size. So the adaptation strategy we went to document was how fishermen, and this is Willie, one of the community leaders that we worked with, they are removing them with a hook and bag. It's again, very simple, but using a hook and a flour bag, and they do these community dives. And they go down one by one and they pry off the starfish as they're eating on the coral, and they roll them into the flour bag. So I have a little GoPro video that I took to show you how this works. So this is a crown of thorn that is feeding on the coral. He's pulling it off very gently because he doesn't want to scare it. Otherwise, she might release her eggs. And then they're rolling them into these flour bags, being very careful not to touch them. And then in one dive, you can get a full flour bag. You might come across 50 or 60 of these starfish. You put them in the bag and then you close the bag off, you tie it off, and you leave it on the bottom of the reef for a few days so that the starfish die and decompose. And then they come back a few days later and they open up the bag, and all of this dead decomposing starfish comes out, and then different fish like parrotfish and triggerfish, other reef fish, will eat the crown of thorns when they're not, of course, in this very menacing, threatening state. So this is the community. Now, I know this sounds incredibly labor intensive, and it is, but they have found that this is actually one of the most effective techniques when they do large community cullings. This is the best way of managing their numbers when there's an outbreak, because you can't just release a toxin or a poison, otherwise you would kill everything on the reef. So it has to be an individual targeted approach. They're also using spear guns with a citric acid solution, so either vinegar or lemon juice, or ox bile in some cases, and you would inject the starfish and flood its body with 2 pumps, and that would also potentially kill the starfish, but they've had less results with this method, or less successful outcomes with this method. And then last but not least, this was my personal favorite, the guys showed me how they are making starfish compost. So one of the techniques they're trying as an adaptation strategy is to, instead of leaving the starfish on the bottom of the reef to rot, they bring the bags ashore and they lay them out on the sand to dry for maybe 2 weeks. And then they chop up the starfish with a machete or a starfish grinder, and they turn it into a compost, which they then bring to the Tatu, who's the guy who runs the nursery on the island. And he makes a compost fertilizer. So he integrates the ground up starfish into a fertilizer, and then he plants saplings. And this is a way of kind of bringing the problem off the reef and using it as a solution on shore. Now, this has also been met with varied success because starfish are very salty, and obviously having salt in your soils is not good. So they're trying to come up with different techniques to either, wash away put the starfish in the bottom of a riverbed so that the fresh water will wash away some of the salt before they use them as a fertilizer. But you can see the innovation and the ideas that these communities are coming up with to find ways to adapt to very difficult realities. As I mentioned, the predatory starfish, like a crown of thorn, is not directly a climate change issue per se, but it is seriously, the threats of it are seriously multiplied by climate change, because they've noticed that the crown of thorn outbreaks happen when the waters are warmer, when there's pollution, and also because of the aquarium trade. They are taking away some of the smaller reef fish that eat the gamete form of the crown of thorn. So this episode, there will be a lot online about this when it comes out, and you guys will get to watch it if you're interested and learn a little bit more about how the community, all these approaches that I just described, we showcase that in the series. So as I said, it's coming soon. Please feel free to tune into my personal website and webpage, which I will share with you so you can learn a little bit more about that. I just want to mention that, of course, with adaptation, they're not all solutions. And in many instances, a lot of adaptation responses to climate change are coping strategies. And sometimes coping strategies turn into solutions. But in many places I've gone in my research, I have often mostly seen coping strategies. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because adaptation is a process that is a trial and error experience. There is a lot of failure. I have seen a lot of communities fail at their projects, but that is the essence of what adaptation is about. It is being creative. It is thinking outside of the box and coming up with different ways of looking at problems. And I think I recently came across this quote by Charles Darwin that I think captures the essence of adaptation so well. He says, "It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." So in other words, it's the one that adapts. It's the question is, how good are you at moving with change when it arrives? How do we not dig our heels in and say, this is the only way of doing this, I don't want to do it any other way, but how do we come up with flexible, creative, innovative ways of living with profound change? And that is the goal. My goal with the series is to showcase how other communities around the world who have far less than we do here in America, what are they doing and how are they finding the will to persevere and come up with creative solutions that are completely counterintuitive to conventional ecological wisdom in a lot of places, as we saw in Madagascar. I don't have time for this, so I just want to end by giving you guys my website, which is just alizecarrère.com. I will be posting on there. I have lots of classroom resources up there for teachers, for students. All of the adaptation work is on there in a tab in the top right called Adaptation. Then there's a classroom tab for different series that I host, one of which is Crash Course. I don't know if you guys know about Crash Course. I know that a lot of high school students do. I am now the host for the Crash Course Geography series. We just started a few weeks ago, and for the next year, we are releasing one episode a week on a different geography-related topic. And so if you just search Crash Course Geography, you'll see you can subscribe to the channel, and we cover all kinds of things. We have a climate change episode coming up, and I would love for you guys to tune in. So I will leave it at that. Feel free to find me on social media at Alizé Carrère. And I think we might be out of time, but if there is time for a question, I will take it.
I do think that we have to wrap it up. We're going to do one question. So
Sure.
You can pick whichever one you want to answer. Someone asked if there are sites in South Florida that train drivers in this technique. Divers.
If they're with the starfish technique.
Yes, the starfish technique.
Yeah, no, we don't have crown of thorns here. As far as I'm aware, anyway. I'm now that I'm saying that, I'd have to double check, but I'm not entirely certain that we have that crown of thorns. They're native to the Indo-Pacific region, but I mean, I think that in the South Pacific where I was, they are absolutely training divers, and in fact, you can even if you dive in places in Vanuatu, they will sometimes give you a free dive if you go out with some of the equipment to specifically take out starfish. So yeah, I'm almost certain we don't have crown of thorns here, but I mean, who knows? They're starting to spread. That is for certain. But as of now, I don't believe that's a reality here yet, and I hope not. Oh, I'm so happy to see people saying that they love Crash Course. Yes, please tune in. I'd love to have you guys join along for the journey.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. We really enjoyed it. We put the link to your website in the chat, so if anyone wants to visit. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yes, and thank you for the comments in the chat, people confirming that no, we do not have crown of thorns here. And yes, to answer your question, it is for people who do travel to Vanuatu, you can, as I said, there are some dive shops that are encouraging tourism in a way for the culling of starfish to keep their reefs safe. So thank you all so much. And please feel free to reach out, send me messages on social media, email. I'm always accessible.